Welcome to OPA's The Right Dose live education series. Really appreciate you coming today. Today we're going to talk about vaccinations and some of the newest information that is hot off the press on COVID-19 vaccines. Our agenda for this lunchtime is I've got a very short introduction, then we'll go to the presentation, and then afterwards Q&A. Lots of time for Q&A. I want to thank Moderna for their sponsorship of this webinar and all their support for pharmacy along the way. Because of the Ontario Pharmacists Association, I have to give a little pitch for our conference that's happening May 13th, and it will be a virtual conference again. And this year you'll be able to earn up to 10 CEUs because you'll be able to get CEUs after the conference, and all you have to do is watch the presentations and you'll still have access to the speakers to ask them any questions. So it's a much different this year. Lots of stuff to see and a great lineup, amazing keynote speakers, and I'm sure you are familiar with them. So our guest speaker today is Dr. Zhao Hu. And I'm just going to stop sharing so that he can start sharing his. He's a public health physician in Alberta and also a professor at the University of Calgary. He works in the East Calgary Health Center, an inner city family health medicine practice serving marginalized population. Dr. Hu's areas of interest include pharmaceutical policy in low to middle income countries, immunization policy, and primary care and public health systems. Dr. Hu previously worked in management consulting for McKinsey & Company, where he provided strategic advice to companies in the healthcare space, including pharmaceutical companies, pharmaceutical distributors, and private equity firms. He also previously worked as a consultant at the London School of Economics. In his role, he provided advice to the Chinese government on pharmaceutical policy reform, including areas of drug quality, pricing, access, and reimbursement, as well as the Qatari government on health systems reform, including health systems structuring and financing. Welcome, Dr. Hu.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for joining today. Well, I wonder where these bios come from, but it's kind of random. But I mean, the first thing, so I'm Jia. I mean, perhaps more salient, I'll have a quick bio slide, but I mean, I was a medical officer of health at the AHS for much of the pandemic, where I was greatly involved in things like the scale of contact tracing and testing, but also the vaccine rollout. And I did want to say for everybody who's joined, and it's a small intimate group, so I feel like it'll be more fun. Really, really grateful for all the work the pharmacist profession put into COVID. We really wouldn't be able to vaccinate people without you. And so while I primarily work in Alberta, I actually do quite a lot of work with the Ontario Ministry and various public health units since I did do my residency here. This is a very annoyingly long bio slide, but I mean, other things of interest might be the fact, like I am on NACI as a liaison representative for the Canadian College of Family Practitioners, and then I do a bunch of random other stuff, but who cares what I do? Let's just talk. So, I mean, you know, lots of vaccines have been given, right? Like I read I was watching CP24 this morning, and I saw that 89% of Torontonians have been given you know, more than two or more doses, which is really, really good. But, you know, as things sort of go, you know, I think that the landscape of vaccination is always still changing, and it can be kind of hard to keep up with, I think. And so even today, there's a NACI meeting that my colleague is going to where we're talking about boosters for the general public. And I don't know what they're going to recommend. I don't think they'll recommend them, but, you know, it's evolving quickly. So I'm going to try to go through this very quickly, and then we can just have a nice little discussion. But, you know, why is vaccination important? Obviously, you know this, but I mean, it prevents serious outcomes like hospitalizations and death. And, you know, more than 36,000 Canadians have died from COVID. You know, it's useful for preventing post-COVID syndrome or long COVID, or whatever you want to call it. And we don't really have a precise estimate of its incidence or prevalence yet, but it's not low and it can be quite debilitating. You know, as we're opening up in Ontario, Alberta, BC, everywhere else, you know, vaccinations are really what allows us to sort of stay open. And I think it really is important to sort of stay open as much as possible, if we can, given a lot of the sort of harmful activities linked to, well, harmful effects of lockdowns. It's interesting. I don't know if you guys are following, but right now Hong Kong is having, I'll call it their first real wave. And they are getting completely overwhelmed and devastated because their vaccination rate amongst the elderly is quite low. In Canada, we've always seen a higher vaccination rate. The older you are, that kind of generally goes down the younger you are. But their system is getting completely overwhelmed after managing COVID relatively well until the Omicron wave came by, and so it presages things that might happen if we don't keep our vaccination rates very high for everybody, but especially the vulnerable. And then lastly, I mean, a lot of these sort of vaccine mandate things have been lifting. They still needed to fly. The feds probably will change that at some point as well, but you never know when these things will swing back if they need to. And so basically vaccination is important. We now have a number of vaccines, right? Pfizer and Moderna being our two preferred vaccines. It hasn't been that long since it's been out. I remember reading about the press release in December 2020, which was a bit over 15 months ago, and saying, holy moly, these work so well, better than we thought they would. Along the way, we had the viral vector vaccines come out, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. And then very recently, we've had the approval of the Novavax and Medicago vaccines, which I'll talk about briefly. But I mean, I think that the bottom line around all these vaccines is, one, it's good we have a bunch of them. Two, mRNA is still the best. And three, having options is good for people who don't want mRNA vaccines for whatever reason. So lots of vaccines out there, lots still in development, actually. But I mean, it's been quite a, in the same way there's been a huge lift when it comes to the distribution and administration of vaccines, so too on the back end has been a huge lift in terms of the production and manufacturing of those vaccines. So I'm going to go really quickly over some of our data on pre-Omicron mRNA vaccine effectiveness. And so, some key takeaways there are that, before the way we tended to look and evaluate drugs, and we still, mainstay would have been the use of randomized control trials. But nowadays, we basically just use real world evidence, which I think is really interesting, very good, because I mean, RCTs obviously are very strong in what they can tell us. But real world evidence is in some ways better because of the fact that you could include literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of people to look at how effective vaccines are. And it's really the only way to get real-time insight into how good vaccines, say, work against, well, Delta or Omicron, because none of those were in randomized control trials. And so that's been a big shift in sort of how we understand vaccine effectiveness and safety. Kind of linked to that big shift, though, is the fact that, if there isn't just one pivotal trial and we have real-world evidence coming in from the US and the UK and, Poland and Canada, it kind of gets confusing. And so, normally at a place like NACI or the ministries where I sort of work, you tend to have all these people summarizing all the studies coming out for you. And, and with that, I can barely keep up. And so it's quite hard for others. But so anyways, lots of real world evidence. Vaccines were, very effective against symptomatic infection at the get-go. And then we do see waning in the pre-Omicron era, particularly for infection as opposed to for hospitalization. And then, there's this weird thing where people prefer Pfizer over Moderna. And, that's something we sort of observed sort of across the country. And I mean, I think for a long time, we're like, okay, they're the same. And I mean, one could argue that there's some things about Moderna that are better, but let's just say they're the same for now. I think that sort of this preference has actually driven down uptake of vaccines when we've had relative shortages of one over the other. And so, just all mRNAs are very good, probably the message there. So we will go through some data, and all of these I borrowed from NACI presentations, basically. So, I mean, if you look at this looks at Pfizer's vaccine effectiveness against, on the left side, symptomatic infection. So you see it falls from 93% to 53% for Delta variant. And on the right side, against hospitalization over a 4-month time period, and it doesn't really fall. And so that's good on the hospitalization front. Not so good on the, symptomatic infection front. And, around this time, the goal really of public health, some of us were saying the goal is to prevent hospitalizations only, some of us, or severe outcomes. Some of us are saying we want to prevent cases as well as hospitalizations. And I think since Omicron's happened, I don't think anybody thinks that we can really stop infection, but we can stop severe infection. And I'll talk more about Omicron, but that's really sort of changed a lot of the ways we look at COVID and our policies around COVID. Some data from Moderna, again, just a bit less waning, 94% and 80% for the Delta variant against symptomatic infection, and similarly highest Pfizer for hospitalization. But I mean, if there's one main message around these two vaccines, it'd be like, they're pretty much the same. Moderna probably wanes less. That would be it. I mean, I have to back my point around real world evidence. There's so many like data points on this. So this was a study out of the UK looking at waning, but this time we also looked at AstraZeneca. They used quite a lot of AstraZeneca there. And you can see that, while Pfizer vaccine effectiveness sort of fell to, 70, 55%, AstraZeneca fell more. Hospitalization, again, for the mRNA vaccines remained above 90%, which is very good. But protection against hospitalization with AstraZeneca was in the sort of 70 to 80% range. And so AZ is not as good a vaccine. I mean, for anybody who got the AZ vaccine, I also don't want people to feel like, what's the word? Like they made a bad decision, because I think that at the time when we had major shortages, getting the vaccine, and that vaccine was pretty good against like Alpha or the other variants, or even before variants. And so, I mean, I basically, like, it is generally better to have protection against something than to wait and not be protected for a long period of time. But I mean, at this point, we now have enough mRNA and we know it's a bit better than the viral vector vaccines. Again, another study from North Carolina with about 11 million people, 10.5 million people. And you see how, vaccine effectiveness against symptomatic infection, is a bit higher for Moderna than for Pfizer. But for hospitalization, which is probably what we care about more now, was quite high for both Moderna and Pfizer, the mRNA vaccines, and for death, also very, very high. Okay. So, I mean, if I were to summarize what we knew until Omicron came out, what we were basically thinking was these mRNA vaccines are pretty good against Delta, especially against hospitalization. We were beginning to see waning protection against symptomatic infection. And that was before there was a recommendation for boosting the general public. And so that's kind of, we were like, this would be like, November 2021. And at NACI, we were thinking like, should we boost the general public? Should we not? And then Omicron came along to make it sort of easier for us in terms of what we should do. So with Omicron, there is significantly more immune waning. And right now, like, all we have is Omicron, right? There's like the BA1 original Omicron, and then the BA2, which is like a variant on the Omicron. It's about 30% more infectious and about the same severity. The BA2 accounts for about half the cases in Canada now. So that's sort of, there's no more Delta, really, realistically. And so with Omicron, we saw more immune waning, which means that boosters were absolutely critical for adults. And then, we've very recently come into, some data around how well these things work in kids in the real world setting. And we'll talk about that. But basically, they don't work as well in kids as they do for grownups. And so there's almost this like, the younger you are, the less good the vaccines work, which is kind of interesting, because usually vaccines work better the younger you are, because you're able to mount a stronger immune response. So this is a little slide from, again, the United Kingdom. And so if you look at the sort of the black dots, they're Delta, the gray circles are Omicron. And this is sort of what happens over time after 2 doses of on this sort of left panel, with 2 doses of a Pfizer vaccine. So you see with Delta, there's some waning, 90 to 60. With Omicron, there's like near total waning to, from like 60 to like 10. But if you get a booster, you see that with the Pfizer booster, again, Delta, very good protection. Omicron, you get bumped right back up. Sorry, ooh, my bad. But then you see some waning. And then, again, with Moderna, very similar, you get bumped right back up. And there's some waning, a bit less than with Pfizer. For what it's worth, I mean, in terms of why we think Moderna leads to lower waning, like a lot of it, I think, is the dose probably. And that's also why you see more myocarditis. And that's why we have a preferential recommendation for the Pfizer over the Moderna in younger people who have a higher risk of baseline myocarditis from the vaccine anyways. And this looked at symptomatic infection protection, but these sort of 3 studies looked at protection against hospitalization. And so is basically saying that, if you had 2 doses after 6 months or so, which is where a lot of us were in like late fall, right before Omicron came. Data from the UK, CDC and Kaiser, which is a big health system in the United States, showed about, I'll say, 45 to 70% protection against hospitalization. But if you got a booster, like in each of these studies has, I'll say tens of millions of people in them. If you had a booster, you bring your protection against hospitalization back up to 90%, which really, again, highlights the importance of that booster for adults. Now, when it comes to actual uptake of the booster, like no province is a particularly high booster uptake, for better or for worse, right? And so I think we're all kind of struggling with getting booster rates at the same level as the primary series rates, and a few reasons I think that's happening. But insofar as you can encourage people to get the booster, the better. So yeah. And then this is a bit of a busy table, but it shows sort of how good the Pfizer pediatric vaccine works against Omicron and Delta. So on the left hand, and this stuff came out in the last few weeks, so again, this stuff is changing quite constantly. But on the left hand, we're looking at the effectiveness of 2-dose Pfizer for 5 to 11-year-olds and 12 to 15-year-olds against symptomatic or asymptomatic infections. They actually swabbed everybody. And so you see how, at between 2 and 8 weeks, am I doing my math right? No, I'm not. Between like 2 and 10 and 12 weeks, you see protection against symptomatic infection for Omicron falling to about 31%. It's a bit higher for the 12 to 15-year-old range, where it sort of is around 59% to 60%. And you see how all these numbers are lower than for Delta. And so this looks at symptomatic infection or asymptomatic infection. On the right hand, we have a chart from Klein et al. Looking at 2 doses against urgent care or hospitalization admission. And so if we're looking at hospitalization, which is, on the far right, and this includes both Omicron and Delta, we do at least see that the percentages here are reasonably robust, 74, 92, 94. For urgent care visits for Omicron only, again, they're lower, 51, 45, 34. One thing the study also looked at, which I have in a bullet point here, is that, while this number, let's say 34%, fell further after 150 days, a booster did restore protection to 81%, which again speaks to the importance of boosters in even the pediatric population. So right now, as you may or may not know, there's been attempts at getting a vaccine authorized for the under 5s, but unfortunately, the trial data for under 5s showed that the vaccine wasn't very effective. And so, I think the companies are going back to the drawing board and making like a 3-dose primary series as opposed to a 2-dose. But that's sort of up in the air still. The other thing that is being developed right now are Omicron specific vaccines. And so the vaccine that is in a Pfizer vaccine the antigen in a Pfizer vaccine or a Moderna vaccine was really like the original antigen used against like original ancestral COVID. And so it wasn't really until Omicron that we felt that there was a specific need for an Omicron specific vaccine, because even with Delta and the waning protection against infection, there was still, fairly robust protection against hospitalization. I would anticipate that those Omicron specific vaccines would be available sometime in the summer. But that depends on a lot of factors. So I guess the bottom line with kids here is that, it's not as good as for adults. I think it definitely is something that kids should still get. We have seen far, far more pediatric admissions during the Omicron sort of era per capita than almost like everything before Omicron put together. And almost like a 10x increase in admissions per 100,000, because just so many people are getting Omicron, including children. And we, while these vaccines aren't 95% effective, they're certainly better than having nothing. Oh, all right. Next section, I'll talk briefly about provincial and federal guidelines on vaccination. And so Right now, I mean, key takeaways around just how these decisions are made. NACI, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, does set overall guidance for the provinces, but the provinces ultimately have decision-making power when it comes to who is eligible for what and when. And probably the starkest example of this, and I'm really glad Ontario did this, is that NACI recommends a third dose booster 6 months after you complete your primary series, but Ontario narrowed that to 3 months. And as a result, way more people were eligible for that third dose booster. And so again, NACI recommends, and we all listen to them. But again, the provinces like Ontario have the ultimate responsibility. Boosters are recommended now for everybody 12 and older. But it's particularly important in people who are 50 plus, immunocompromised, who live in congregate settings, Indigenous populations, and healthcare workers. We are beginning fourth doses in some immunocompromised populations, as well as people in congregate settings in Ontario. And very recently, the Moderna vaccine is available for 6 to 11-year-olds. So I feel like everybody should know these recommendations, but I mean, maybe from the NACI statement, it would be this, that like everybody 18 plus should get a booster. And now it's that's basically what should happen. And then certain groups, these ones in red, 50 and older, congregate living, Indigenous healthcare workers are really especially should get a booster. All right, so real briefly, Novavax is one of these new vaccines that was approved just recently, and it's a protein subunit vaccine. And protein vaccines are sort of the mainstay of most of the ways vaccines are made. Very effective in the clinical trials against alpha and beta. We don't really have data against how well it works against Omicron because the trials did not coincide in time with when Omicron was around. Interestingly enough, from sort of an immune study perspective, we think that this should work, as in it does generate neutralizing antibodies and a decent T cell response. But again, without that clinical data, it's hard to know for sure. And as a result, NACI recommends this for people who are unable or unwilling to take an mRNA vaccine. And so that's Novavax, one of our new vaccines. It should be available pretty soon, I think, in Ontario. The other sort of new vaccine that came out around the same time was Medicago's vaccine. And this has two claims to fame, I like to say. One of which is the company is Canadian, based in Quebec, which is cool. The other of which is that, so this is a virus-like particle vaccine. So like the human papilloma vaccine is also like a virus-like particle, but it's actually manufactured from a tobacco plant. And very strangely, actually, I was Googling this, Philip Morris, the company that makes Camels and lots of other cigarettes, actually owns a third of Medicago, and the other part is owned by a big pharma company. And so, there you go, big tobacco diversifying into vaccines. This vaccine is only approved for age 18 to 64. All the other ones are approved 18 and older at least. And the reason being, in their clinical studies, there weren't enough people who were 65 and older to really assess efficacy. Again, as with Novavax, we don't know how well this works against Omicron because Omicron is so new. And so like with Novavax, we say it can be given to people who don't want to receive or unable to receive an mRNA vaccine for some reason. And so really, when it comes to all these different vaccines, the mRNA vaccines remain our mainstay because they seem to be, one, the most effective. Two, we have the most data on it, including real world evidence on how well they work against Omicron. And three, we actually have the largest data around the safety profile because, like 1 billion people have received one of the mRNA vaccines. It is good, I think, though, to have some of these options. I've talked like my friend, I have a few friends who are not into vaccines, and one of them was like, I want this Medicago vaccine, it's plant-based. That doesn't entirely make sense to me, but I think again it's better to give your patient something than nothing if they're willing to take something. And so that's Medicago. And then most recently, this is very, very fresh. I think it was last week. Moderna's vaccine can be given now in children 6 to 11 years of age. The Pfizer vaccine is still preferred due to the the higher rates of myocarditis potentially. But I mean, at the end of the day, we think the Moderna vaccine might actually work better in children. I mean, the Moderna vaccine just seems to be a bit more effective, maybe because the dose is higher. Don't know exactly why, but for now, NACI is saying the Pfizer vaccine is preferred due to the myocarditis risk. And so, I mean, when it comes to counseling patients on mRNA vaccine, like what I generally say is like, just take one, like just take one. And so there's that. Another sort of guideline from NACI that came out about a month and a half ago that was kind of useful actually was just on intervals when it comes to vaccination. And so basically it says that, you know, if you get COVID before you start or finish your primary series, then you want to wait 8 weeks after infection to finish or start your primary series. And so that's people on dose 0 or on dose 1. And for people who have had COVID but have finished their primary series but haven't had their booster, they say wait 3 months. And, you know, the reason why we say that is because, you know, reinfection, while possible, is extremely unlikely, nearly impossible within a 90-day period. One of the good things I was mentioning earlier about this BA2 subvariant is that we don't think it can cause reinfection of people who've been infected by BA1, the original Omicron, which is really good because, I mean, it is more infectious. And, you know, we think about, you know, 4 million, 5 million Ontarians have had Omicron from our modeling. And so it's a large sort of pool of immunity there. And then some Ontario specific guidance. So, I mean, third doses 18 plus can be given 84 days after the second dose. If you're 12 to 17, 168 days. And this 84-day thing, again, is very different than what NACI says, which is 6 months. And good on Ontario for doing that. And for people who are immunocompromised, you can actually get a third dose 8 weeks after the second dose. And that's more of as an extended primary series. Fourth doses are open to people in congregate living, so long-term care, lodges, elderly homes, those sorts of things. And then fourth doses are also being offered in immunocompromised populations. Again, 84 days after third dose if you're 18 plus, 168 days after the third dose if you're 12 to 17. And you can go to this website to see sort of who qualifies. But I mean, it's like people who are like pretty immunosuppressed, like transplant type stuff. And so that is what they're saying in Ontario right now. And actually, that pretty much brings me to the end of my presentation. I just left this up here, you know, for discussion, reopening in the endemic state. If anybody had any questions about reopening, you know, I do a lot of work with, like, I mean, I just say I work with the Ontario Ministry and Alberta Ministry. We talk a lot about that. And so I will stop. And sorry for that minor technical kerfuffle.
It happens. The technical stuff happens. I thank you very much. That was really interesting. Lots of stuff there, short and sweet. And what I wanted to, as somebody who decided to have one of each, what kind of data is coming in on mixed doses? So I was an AZ plus Moderna plus Pfizer because I like to go to the buffet. So any kind of information on that?
Yeah, so I think that if you had AZ, let me just open this. There is some data from the UK on this, I think. And so hold on, let me just, I will get back to you on that. I mean, I think that, you know, fundamentally, like the AZ, and this is a really common scenario, actually, right? If you're an AZ and then you got a booster with an mRNA, like you complete with mRNA and then another mRNA, I mean, I don't think it's as good as having like 3 straight mRNAs. A lot of your effectiveness is actually, though, going to depend on when you last got your mRNA, because immunity wanes quite quickly with Omicron. And one population that has, like, we haven't opened fourth doses to people like you, and I kind of wish we did, actually, because I don't know when you got your third dose. There's probably actually
December.
Okay, so you're still okay. I mean, it's been 2 and a few months, but like, you know, not as good as sort of the straight mRNA series. but also heavily linked to when you had your last dose. And so I'm hoping that, as I said, NACI is talking about boosters for the general public today, or fourth doses, and so I would hope that they recommend this at some point in the near future, but I don't think they will yet.
Yes, they were saying, yes, it's your spring dose. Somebody was commenting on Twitter today about your spring dose, and then there's going to be a fall dose, and then lots of, you guys have any questions, just put it in the Q&A. We have, again, what the data on waning effectiveness of mixed series, which I think is something that I don't hear a lot talked about. It's always, everybody had Pfizer all along, or they had Pfizer, Moderna, and I think there's some kind of a dearth of discussion or evidence, I guess, at this point on that information. So not seeing any new questions coming in from the participants. Just let the participants know that this is recorded and it will be put on our website and available for people to see again. Lots and lots of good information. If you have any questions about anything here, just email education@opatoday.com and we can respond to that. Appreciate everybody coming and listening, and I learned some new stuff, so I'm happy. Oh,
hey, I'm going to share my screen. Oh, yeah. You go. I'm just going to answer your question around mixed dosing. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to show you a graph. And then I will take Sarah Lynn Dunlop's question. So this is data, again, from the UK. And this bottom panel is what I showed before with 2 doses of Pfizer, and how well it worked against Omicron and the effect of a booster. And this up here is 2 doses of AstraZeneca, and then how well a booster performed against it. And so, if you sort of had 1 AZ and 1 Pfizer, like as opposed to 2 Pfizer, 2 AZs, effectiveness is kind of like in between these two. I think the big thing to note is that when I said a lot of it depends on when you got your 3rd dose, you'll see that people who had 2 doses of AZ and then had a Pfizer booster by 10 weeks out only had 40% protection, very similar to people who had 2 doses of Pfizer initially and then had a Pfizer booster 10 weeks out, right? And the same sort of applies for Moderna. And so the spatial, like the temporal difference between when you got your last dose, I think is one of the really big predictors of how protected you'll be against hepatic infection. So, yeah.
Interesting.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Wash your hands, wear a mask, stay away from people. Don't go. I'll try to stay away from schools.
Oh.
So we've got, are there any recommendations for kids who had a pediatric dose at age 11, a few months shy of turning 12 when they turn 12?
Yeah, I mean, I think they'll get a adult dose. I mean, it depends on what they get, right? Like, so they got a pediatric Pfizer dose, 10 microgram. When they turn 12, they can get the 30 microgram dose, or a 50 microgram Moderna dose. The Moderna dose for kids is the same is the Moderna kid dose is the same as the Moderna booster dose. But I mean, honestly, when it comes to like this, there's like kind of these arbitrary cutoffs, right? Like it's not like an 11-year-old is very different than a 13-year-old. We kind of just draw a line somewhere, and we do that because we have to. We kind of like a little knob where we change the dose based on how much you weigh. I think that for any kids, getting a higher dose is probably better in my mind. Like I want kids to get the adult dose. I say that because, to your point, Ruth, I think that it is hard to contain the transmission of Omicron in the school setting. And right now, what we're seeing in Ontario and Canada is so over the last few months, there's been a pretty steady decline in the number of cases. And that's been because people have kind of been not hanging out too much with one another. And now we're seeing an uptick, totally understandable because people are going out and about. And I think it's important for people to go out and about and for people to go to school. This kind of mirrors Europe, which has seen Europe was always let's say 3 to 4 weeks ahead of us, they've also seen this resurgence as we sort of get back together. And so, even though these vaccines in kids are not going to be 100% preventing infection, they certainly add quite a lot of protection when it comes to preventing kids from being in the hospital. And so, yeah, they'll get the adult dose, which I think is a good thing, basically. That's my very long way of saying that.
Well, thank you. I think it's, I just keep going back to the flu shot, right? Like flu happens at Christmas and New Year's. Kids are off, they're playing with one another, they're inside, and everybody comes back in January sick with the flu, etc. So I think this is going to be the same, right? It's a respiratory virus. It's transmitted well, actually, there's some controversy on fomites, but we won't go there. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you everybody for participating, and have a great day, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.